This past week I saw the last Harry Potter movie. I had gotten really committed to seeing the movies, but it was only until the last year or two that I got around to starting to read the books. And only on breaks between classes, so needless to say I never made it to the end of the series before I saw the last movie. But there's something about these books that's held the world captive. That people have lined up outside of bookstores waiting for the next one and filling movie theaters at midnight just so that they can say they saw it before everyone else they know. It's a good story. A couple of years ago, Donald Miller, who wrote a book called Blue Like Jazz that seemed to sweep across the Christian world, he wrote a book called 1,000,000 Miles in 1,000 Years. It was part a story of turning the book Blue Like Jazz into a film, and part his journey of learning how to live a full life. In the middle of this memoir-like book, they define story as a character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. It sounds a bit like our Harry Potter character. Even if all he wants is a peaceful life and goodness for his friends and, of course, ultimately the girl. So I spent the whole week thinking about stories. The story that we have today about Jacob seems to be a story along the way. It's a story on the road that gets us from the promise that he's given by God to the promise fulfilled in the birth of his children by the 4 women mentioned. Jacob is sent by his parents to his mother's brother to find a wife from Rebekah's family. Yes, that does mean Jacob, in fact, marries his cousins. And the first person he meets along the way is Rachel, believed to be the great beauty of the family, and he fell in love. His goal was marriage, and he wanted her. He would do anything to make her his wife. A character who wants something and overcomes conflict to get it. So in some ways, Jacob's is a good story. I imagine for many years sitting around fires that this story was told and taught. The scholarship believes that these stories weren't actually written by Moses, like the tradition says, but that they were collected and written and edited in the time surrounding the Babylonian exile in the 500s BCE. This time that remains pivotal in the Jewish history. It was during this time that the first temple was destroyed. Many of the leaders and citizens of Israel were taken away and dumped into Babylon. Israel was a smaller and weaker nation. And pretty much had always been. They were always the underdog when it came to wars and battles, and sometimes they won, and sometimes they didn't. But imagine being a small and captive, weak people. There is hope in reminding yourself that your roots are based in Jacob, the smaller and weaker brother. Reminding yourself that you are a nation with a call and a right to a land. What that does to remind you that you have a home. Jacob is a good story for people to hold on to and remember. Trying to have a place to remember where they belong and who they are. And in a way, in a very real way, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, lived the faith and lived the stories. The ancient stories shape who they are till today, how they see the world and how they live. There's a deep connection to who one is and the stories they tell. There are stories we live out every day. I listen to a lot of podcasts, particularly when I'm driving, and there's one called The Moth. It's recordings of folks who get up on stage and tell a story of their lives without notes. The stories go from silly to life-changing. And at the end of every podcast, they say, we hope you have a story-worthy week. It's sort of a blessing. Sort of a benediction at the end of a 15-minute experience into someone else's life. And I wonder what it means. How does one have a story-worthy week? See, there are folks that get up and tell great stories about something that happened in their lives. Like the guy who told a story about how he'd been traveling somewhere and had been warned that there are birds that will fly over and dive at people. The story was evident to him. He was telling in the context that one day he was walking through campus and this bird started to fly and he freaked out because he'd been attacked by these other birds and he hit the sidewalk. And the Nobel laureate he was showing around campus just sort of looked at him. There's a woman who got shown up when she was 13 years old at a dance by a boy. She went home and refused to be humiliated again. She learned to dance in her bedroom, showed this boy up on the dance floor the next time, and ultimately was on stage with the great James Brown. Story-worthy moments. I can't always remember what happened yesterday. How does one figure out what makes a moment worthy of a story? How does one document it in their mind? But more than a moment, how does one have a life worthy of a good story? What does a life worth telling the story? What is a life worth telling a story about? A life that one lives in and co-creates with God that makes a good story. Jacob had a story. He had a relentless pursuit of a blessing, and now in this part of the story, for a wife. He overcame the obstacle of being the second born to get the blessing, and he labors for 7 years for his uncle. Not for money, not for land, but for Laban's youngest daughter. And then has to labor 7 more because Laban wanted something too. He wanted both of his daughters married. Leah, this scripture says she had lovely eyes. There are others that say she had peculiar eyes. Rachel, the brassy and beautiful one. Laban would do anything to make sure that both girls were married all the way to the point of deceit. The trickster in our story becomes the victim of another trickster. The deceiver was deceived. If we were of a different faith, we might be able to say that one ought to look out for karma. It'll come around and get you in the end. Both of these men overcame conflict to see what they wanted achieved. There's a good story here. But are our lives good stories? Well, it's wanting something and overcoming conflict to get it. It's more than just wanting something for ourselves. We know that. In this part of the story, there is both a hero and a villain. Jacob the hero and Laban the villain. And we know in Harry Potter there's Harry the hero and Voldemort the villain. Well, they all wanted something. We see certain things as more important, more life-giving, more fulfilling than others. When we watch a movie and the lead character wants more house, more car, more money, to feed his or her own ego and personal desires, that is not the person we cheer for throughout the film. Want of love and harmony, wholeness and justice, want for something that extends outside of oneself, that is the making of a good story. I have a friend at school named Grant Crusoe. I only give you the full name in case you want to look it up later. He had a book of poems that tell a love story. And he found a publisher and had his book Nowhere to Hide published while he was still in seminary. And the second book having just been published a month or so ago as an ebook. And it sounds nice and easy, but the reality is there isn't a market for poetry. Particularly poetry that is written by someone no one's heard about. But he got it done. And he got it through, and then when the book is there in one's hands, he's trying to convince a bookstore to sell it. But he was committed, and he didn't give up. He's done book signings at high schools and churches and coffee shops. When one pursues their passions and strives for accomplishing something that is part of themselves and greater than themselves, it's a good story. I learned something else from Grant. A good story invites others into it. C. Grant had a friend do the photography for the book, and the rest of the community at school and his friends did all they could to support him in his efforts, if it was only by our prayers and encouragement and the $10 we bought the book for. Jacob had the support of his parents back home, and it seemed he had the support of Laban. Perhaps the feelings between Rachel and Jacob were mutual, and she was part of the making of his goal complete. And really, we see this in our Harry Potter. What he wanted was freedom and a chance to live in peace and harmony and everyone to be safe, and he invited others into the cause. Conflict came over and over again from other students, but mostly from the evil Dark Lord. Over and over again, they fought for their chance to live, and Voldemort and Laban had their own goals. Instead of gathering people around them to fulfill a larger goal and story, one coerced folks near him, and the other manipulated and lied to get his way. We understand a good story, a good want, a good goal, and a good way to pursue it. Not at the expense of others, be it Rachel or Leah. Not for a cause of power or control or purely for the self. We know good stories. And we live stories. We want good stories as individuals, as our families, and yes, even as a church. Merrimack United Methodist Church, you are living a good story. A good story to build well for those in need. Even in the complications, in the difficulty, in the times when it feels like you're not going to make it. But we're getting there, and every week we are that much closer to the goal. This is a good story. The kind that can be shared and testify to the greatness of this community and the greatness of God. A co-created story that isn't about the church expanding, paying a light bill, or any other physical thing that sometimes needs to happen, but doesn't make for the kind of story that can be proclaimed as truly good, that is movie-making, book-writing, from the stage, story-worthy week. It's something greater than ourselves, greater than this building, greater than this community. It's about loving God and loving others. It's about wanting something and overcoming conflict to get it. And we're getting there. But when this story is over, when the book was published, when the evil was conquered, when the striving and the wedding were over, a new story had to begin. An individual, a family, a church, wanting nothing beyond themselves will never change the world. They will strive for nothing and never be fulfilled. They won't live a good story. But if they want something grounded in the love of God and love of neighbor, and are willing to overcome all kinds of conflict to make it happen, well, we're about to see how that all turns out. Of how it multiplies the good, of how it rallies people you wouldn't expect, and how it creates excitement. This is what the church is about. It's what our families are about and our lives are about co-creating stories. It took Jacob time to be a good story, to live a good story. It took connecting to God and loving another person, inviting people into his life, and connecting with them. His story unfolded over time, from a character who wanted only for himself to someone who was willing to work alongside others for what he wanted, and ultimately returns home asking for forgiveness. It is with God that he created a better story, a better life, a better character out of Jacob. And I can't speak of your own lives or your families, but this congregation, as it concludes a really good story, it's time to start preparing for a new one. New life is happening in this church, new excitement, new technologies, new mission, new visions, new plans, and new goals. Who we are and who we are becoming is a story that is still unfolding, and will continue to fold day after day and year after year. The question is it going to continue to be a good story? One of risk and challenges and change and the unexpected. Is it going to be one that rallies the people and doesn't use them? Is it going to be grounded in loving God and loving others, and the moving where and as the Spirit moves? Are we going to be worthy of the good story? The kind that we will talk about for years to come. The kind that welcomes people in and creates something new. May you live a good story. And may you have a story-worthy week. As we prepare for our time of prayer together, we'll sing 2128 in the black hymnal. And if you have prayer requests you don't want to speak aloud, pass them to the center aisle and pass them out.